One of the key themes of Jorge Luis Borges' short story, Averroes Search, is indeed what it is that Averroes is trying to figure out, which is the meaning of two terms that come up within a work of Aristotle. And we find out from Borges himself that he is narrating a process of failure, a process of defeat. So why would that be the case? It'll happen for more than one reason, as we're going to learn. So we find Averroes working on a response to the destruction of philosophers, his work, The Destruction of the Destruction, where he is responding to an earlier Islamic philosopher and Sufi, al-Ghazali. At the same time, he has another project that he is undertaking, and this is causing him, as Borges says, a worry, a small worry that clouds Averroes' happiness. Not the sort of worry brought on by the tahafut, which was a fortuitous enterprise, but rather a philological problem connected with the monumental work that would justify him to all people, his commentary on Aristotle. Now, philology has to do with the meaning and the origin of words, of terms. So he's trying to figure out what Aristotle means by certain words. And we read that Greek sage, the fountainhead of all philosophy, had been sent down to men to teach them all things that can be known. Interpreting Aristotle's works in the same way as the ulamas interpret the Quran was the hard task that Averroes had set himself. History will record few things lovelier and more moving than this Arab physician's devotion to the thoughts of a man separated from him by a gulf of 14 centuries. So already there's a vast span of time. As a matter of fact, Averroes is separated from Aristotle by more time than we are from those medieval thinkers like Averroes, who, we think of as being so distant in eras, in epochs. So he goes on as well, Borges, and says, to the intrinsic difficulties of the enterprise, we might add that Averroes, who knew neither Syriac nor Greek, was working from a translation of a translation. And we find out what it is that has halted his work. Two doubtful words. It says, the night before, two doubtful words had halted him at the very portals of the Poetics. Now, if you've ever read Aristotle's Poetics, it is indeed a treatise. We're missing a part of which had to do with comedy, and it has to do with drama, with ancient Greek drama. And it covers a lot of different topics, and it focuses mainly, in the portion that we have, on tragedy. So you need to know what tragedy is in order to understand the context of the Poetics. Those words were tragedy and comedy. He'd come across them years earlier. Where? In the third book of the Rhetoric, another one of Aristotle's works, which is closely connected with the Poetics, very important text. And he says, no one in all of Islam could hazard a guess as to their meaning. He had pored through the pages of Alexander of Aphrodisias, often called the commentator. Alexander was a figure who arises in Alexandria, working there from an Aristotelian perspective, engaging the Stoics, engaging the Platonists, engaging other people as well, and wrote commentaries on Aristotle's works. He had pored through these pages, compared the translations of the Nestorian, Hunayan ibn Ishaq, and Abu Bashar Mata, and he'd found nothing. But these two arcane words were everywhere in the text of the Poetics. It was impossible to avoid them. So, without some understanding of what tragedy and comedy mean, well, you can't comment on the poetics, and that means that his project will remain incomplete. So, what is tragedy and comedy? Well, they're parts, you could say, or genres of a greater genre of drama, where people act things out upon a stage, which is something that we do find in many cultures. But interestingly, within the Islamic civilization, at least at the time of Averroes, there's not a lot of instances of that. The exception would be, perhaps you could say, in the Shiite Muslim world, but Averroes is a Sunni, so he's not going to be all that conversant with, for example, reenactments of the martyrdom of Ali and Hussein, right? So he has to figure this out. And we get a very interesting scene early on. There are children who are distracting him outside his window. He looked out through the bars of the balcony. There below in the narrow earthen courtyard, half-naked children were at play. One of them, standing on the shoulders of another, was clearly playing at being a muezzin, the person who calls people to prayer, right? And his eyes tightly closed, he was chanting the muezzin's monotonous cry, "There is no God but Allah." The boy standing motionless and holding him on his shoulders was the turret from which he sang. Another, kneeling, bowing low in the dirt, was the congregation of the faithful. The game did not last long. They all wanted to be the muezzin. No one wanted to be the worshippers or the minaret. Averroes listened to them arguing in the vulgar dialect, that is the incipient Spanish of the Muslim masses of the peninsula. So he's got a clue there that could tell him, what Aristotle's talking about, but he can't recognize it. Then we find there's a second possible example, and this one is really staring him in the face. He is at the house of a friend of his who he is going to learn from the traveler who is now back from, hopefully, China, who's going to tell them miraculous stories and all of that. Abu al-Hasan, he gives an account of a house of painted wood in which many people lived. It's not possible to describe the house. There were balconies. There were people eating and drinking, people sitting on the floor and also on a raised terrace. The people on the terrace were playing the tambour and the lute, except for 20 or 15 who wore crimson masks and prayed and sang and conversed among themselves. These masked ones suffered imprisonment, but nobody could see the jail. They're acting that out. They rode upon horses, but the horse was not to be seen. They're engaging in kind of pantomime. They waged battle, but the swords were of bamboo. They died, then they walked again. And Abu al-Hasan says, they're not madmen. They were, as a merchant told me, presenting a story. And then we get these very interesting lines. No one understood. No one seemed to want to understand. It is a culture that is not understanding what is being put before them in an account, including Averroes himself, who we see able to converse very thoughtfully about many other closely related things. So Abu al-Hasan swerved from the tale he had been telling them into inept explanation. He says, let us imagine someone shows a story instead of telling it. The story of the 7 sleepers of Ephesus. We see them retire into the cavern. We see them pray and sleep. We see them sleep with their eyes open. We see them grow while they're asleep. We see them awaken after 309 years. We see them hand the merchant an ancient coin. We see them awaken in paradise. We see them awaken with the dog. It was something like that that the persons on the terrace showed us that evening. And then Faraj, whose house it is, says, did these people speak? And Hassan says, of course they did. Now become the apologist for a performance he only barely recalled and that had irritated him considerably at the time. They spoke and sang and gave long, boring speeches. Philological says, well, then there was no need for 20 persons. A single speaker could tell everything, no matter how complex it might be. And, in a certain way, that's quite true, right? We have different genres of literature, and we don't always have to act them out. We can read a score of music. We can read the, script for a play. But there's something additional that's contributed by actually having the performance. And that is what they don't see. So Averroes, things don't click for him. He goes home and he is able to figure out what he's going to write. Something had revealed to him the meaning of the two obscure words. Now, has it revealed to him the meaning of the two obscure words? A set of meanings. And he writes, Aristotle, that is Aristotle, gives the name tragedy to panegyrics and the name comedy to satires and anathemas. Okay, so different genres are being conflated here, aren't they? And then he says there are many admirable tragedies and comedies in the Quran. The Quran is not a dramatic work in that respect. It is not a play. It is an entire set of poems, surahs, right, that are, read and recited by Muslims, as well as in the mulaqat of the mosque. So he's trying his best to make sense of what these would be. Then we get Borges adding a kind of interesting touch here. He felt sleep coming upon him. He felt a chill. He looked at himself in a metal mirror. I don't know what his eyes beheld, for no historian has described the forms of his face. I know that he suddenly disappeared, as though annihilated by a fire without light, and that with him disappeared the house and the unseen fountain and the books and manuscripts and the turtle doves and the many black-haired slave girls and the trembling red-haired slave girl and Faraj and Abu al-Hassan and the rose bushes and perhaps even the Guadalquivir. So, what we're going to find out is that Borges is giving us a fictional Averroes. And he calls this the process of failure, the process of defeat, and says, I was trying to narrate that. And then he's going to give us some comparisons. I thought first of that Archbishop of Canterbury, that is Anselm, who set himself the task of proving that God exists. Then I thought of the alchemist who sought the philosopher's stone, then of the vain trisectors of the angle and squares of the circle. Then, this is how he selected his character, I reflected a more poetic case than those would be a man who set himself a goal that is not forbidden to other men, but is forbidden to him. I recalled Averroes, who bounded within the circle of Islam, could never know the meaning of the words tragedy and comedy. I told his story as I went on. I felt what that God mentioned by Burton must have felt, the God who set himself the task of creating a bull, but turned out a buffalo. I felt that the work mocked me, foiled me, thwarted me. I felt, now here's where we're going to get a really interesting comparison, that Averroes, trying to imagine what a play is without having ever suspected what a theater is, was no more absurd than I trying to imagine Averroes, yet with no more material than a few snatches from Renan, Lane, and Asin Palacios. I felt on the last page that my story was a symbol of the man I had been as I was writing it. And in order to write that story, I had to be that man. And in order to be that man, I had to write that story, and so on, ad infinitum. And just when I stop believing in him, Averroes disappears. So, some very interesting reflections bringing this to an end. And what we have here is a character who quite literally cannot imagine what the objects of his commentary are. What is tragedy? What is comedy? Because he cannot imagine a play. It's not that he cannot, in the sense of there is no potential ever for him to do that. But in the cultural situation in which he is, no matter how smart a person Averroes is, at least Borges Averroes, he cannot determine the meaning of those terms any more than we can truly know Averroes himself.